Hello, I'm Tamara Copeland, President of the Washington Regional Association of Grantmakers. RAG, as we shorthand our name, is a collective of foundations and corporate giving programs in Northern Virginia, suburban Maryland, and the District of Columbia. In 2015, a group of philanthropic leaders came together under the RAG umbrella to talk about how they might address the racial unrest that was affecting our country. They decided to heed the words of John Gardner, the founder of the independent sector and Common Cause. He said, "The first step in leadership is not action, it's understanding." We are embarking upon a learning journey. We've entitled it, Putting Racism on the Table. Over the course of 6 months, we will explore the following topics: structural racism, white privilege, implicit bias, mass incarceration, the racial mosaic of America, and then look at how philanthropy is addressing racism across the country. As you're watching this video, we know that you are joining this learning journey with us. We hope that you will use the discussion guide that we have developed as you gather with your colleagues. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "We will not remember the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." I'm delighted that we are no longer silent.
It's so wonderful to see all of you here. I've been asked to share about our work in the Kellogg Foundation and also about the broader national picture of what's going on in terms of this focus on racial equity. I always like to ground things in a historic frame, and I want us to remember that the progress that has been made post the Civil War and enslavement would not have happened had it not been for philanthropy. Even the creation of schools for those who were formerly enslaved and forbidden from having an education, those initial schools were created by philanthropists. And I highly recommend, if you haven't, to research some of that information. It's very grounding in terms of understanding the personal resilience and determination, the leadership that arose from within the community itself to create schools to educate when there were no opportunities. And we still live with that legacy today in terms of the lack of a fair and equitable commitment to the opportunity for education. So fast forward during the Civil Rights Movement, very quietly behind the scenes, foundations like the Ford Foundation were making it possible for the civil rights leaders to do what they did for the trainings and the activism. So I think it's important, those of us who are on this sort of side of the philanthropic curve in terms of racial equity, to just remember that this has been going on for a very long time. Now, when I came into the philanthropic world, which was roughly, as someone, on the grant making side, if you will, it was roughly 10 years ago. Prior to that, most of my career had been funded by foundations. So it was kind of a natural next step. But the Kellogg Foundation had been in the business of racial equity for about 3 decades. Now, they didn't call it that. And so I want to be clear, because this may be true for some of your foundations. There was a group in Michigan called the National Center for the Healing of Racism. And 2 of our key leaders of the Kellogg Foundation, high-level executives, decided to take a weekend workshop with this group. And they came back to the foundation and they said, "This foundation doesn't reflect the people that we're trying to help, and we have to diversify our foundation." If you saw the pictures of the people that worked in the Kellogg Foundation at the time, there was not a single person of color. And so the decision was made to travel the country, interesting decision, and find very qualified people of color, and I'm choosing my words very deliberately, to bring into the Kellogg Foundation in a leadership role. Now, the irony is that one of those people that they went outside of Battle Creek to find was a recent graduate from, had a master's in business administration. Her name was LaJune Montgomery Tabron. She was the first professional person of color hired by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. And now, 29 years later, she's the CEO. So I say that to illustrate the arc, if you will, of the evolving commitment on the part of the Kellogg Foundation. Now, there are people in this room who have been intimately connected with the Foundation's journey. They know the struggle. It was about capitalizing on diversity at one point. It was about multiculturalism at another point. It was about inclusion at another point. They didn't really, I would say, grow up, which, that's not really fair. But they didn't really evolve to the idea of facing the issue of racism squarely in the face until about 10 years ago. Now, notice I didn't say facing the issue of race. I said facing the issue of racism. And that's very different than race. And that was about a decade ago. The board of directors unanimously decided that they were going to become, and it's written in the minutes, and that's comparable to the law, if you will, in the foundation, that they were going to become the most effective anti-racist organization they could be. And it was about that time that they had an opening for a vice president. It was about the same time that Katrina hit and the levees broke in New Orleans. Now, I've been doing, where's our facilitator who said race work? I've been doing race work probably most of my life. When you hear the stories of the killings and the shootings and the tragedies that we've been bombarded with on the last couple of years, most of us who are people of color, it brings up a very visceral reaction for many of us because we relive some of our personal tragedies that have happened in our own families. I can recall that when I was roughly, I think I might have been about 13 years old, and I had a cousin, a first cousin, who was really like a sister to me. And she had her challenges. Fast forward, and one night, a young white man who was about to leave to be deployed in the military came into our African American community thrill-seeking, and somewhere in this encounter, she ended up dead, shot in the chest, and he went off to the service 2 days later. Never a charge filed. When we buried her, even as a teenager, I could not understand how there was no charge, no justice, no equity. And that stayed with me. I remember, and she and I played together as sisters, but yet the only memory that I can conjure up of her to this day is of her in that casket. And so the idea that this racism in our country conjures up personal relatedness, if you will, is very real and very palpable. So I've been doing this work trying to make it make sense most of my career. The first work was a K through 12 multicultural education curriculum, because back then we called it multicultural, right? And we tried to create resources for classroom teachers that revisited the history of this country from multiple perspectives. And I called it a Trojan horse approach, because what we did was present these resources to classroom teachers. We never said to the teachers, you're racist or you don't know what you're doing. We said, you don't have the resources that you need. And so we produced this set of resources, and teachers all over this country were learning at the same time that they were preparing themselves to teach and share this new information for children. We buried within it a program called Appreciative Learning to help the teachers relate differently to the students in terms of teaching them and building relationships with these students and overcoming their own biases with the students. So this work had been going on for a very long time in my life. I had this innate sense of naivete that said, why do people act this way? There has to be a reason. My work at the Kellogg Foundation and building on the work of the National Center for the Healing of Racism, I stumbled upon a framing that has been very eye-opening for me. And it has to do with the belief in a hierarchy of human value. For me, that became the answer to the why. People are motivated by what they believe in their hearts, whether it's going to church on Sunday or becoming a terrorist. The deeply held belief systems drive our behaviors. And the belief in a taxonomy of humanity, which was created in the 18th century, this notion that the human family, like the botanical family, could be ordered in a hierarchy, became the foundational belief of the world we see today. And that taxonomy was created around the time that the printing press proliferated. And so we have this absurd notion, it didn't seem absurd in the 18th century, but that the human family varied in its characteristics and its value, its innate value, based on how it looked physically. Now, when Linnaeus, the botanist, put this together, he hadn't had any interactions with people of different regions and backgrounds in the world, but he built it on the stories that he heard, and he put himself at the top, white male, and then grouped all other people down to the very descending, the last group of people were people from Africa. And so we've lived with this absurd taxonomy. We built this country on that taxonomy. And until we face the absurdity of that taxonomy and what it has wrought in terms of the society we have today, we will not have sustained change. So, as a naive 13-year-old wondering why, this woman today says, it's because that's what people really believe. Now, they believe it deep within their being. And that's where we get into the age of the brain and the neuroscience and the cognitive science. You've read and heard about unconscious bias. If every image you see of the perceived other reinforces this absurd notion of a taxonomy of value, then that becomes your automatic response to people who are different. And those stereotypes come up faster than it's amazing how quickly those reactions occur, especially under stress. But when you have the capacity to make life and death decisions in an instant, like police officers, if those stereotypes and those fears are going to pop up instantly and you have a gun in your hand, then the risk of you acting on that impression is quite great. And the urgency of us giving people the tools and the resources to come to grips with those biases and to overcome them, that urgency becomes acute. So at the Kellogg Foundation, roughly about 10 years ago, after they made the decision to be the most effective anti-racist organization they could be, I was offered a job there as a vice president for health. Katrina had hit, and we had seen people standing on rooftops pleading for help. Now, you may remember the polling data at the time, and people of color felt it was racism, that they were neglected. Others felt it was just bureaucratic mismanagement, but those divisions were pretty clearly racial. I, being a person of color, felt that this was another manifestation of structural racism. And I tell this story, but I actually got down on my knees and prayed to be able to be more effective in helping this country deal with racism. And I always say, be careful what you pray for. So it was really about 2 weeks after that prayer, I get the call and I'm invited to become a part of the Kellogg Foundation. And there I am, loving this region, invited to Battle Creek. Oh well, I had to make the decision to do that. The 5th largest foundation in the world had made that kind of board level commitment. And I do have to say that that is a requirement for a foundation to be effective in this work. The board of directors has to authorize this work. So some of the most important work you must do as grant makers is make sure that your board is in agreement and supportive of the work. And that sometimes takes a while. And it took a long time for our board to come to that. Actually, our board had to diversify before it came to that. And I should digress a little bit. The challenge with small, diverse boards is that people bring their own priorities into the boardroom. And so we have a small, diverse board representing many different groups, and some board members feel their role is to champion the needs of their group. So you have African American, Asian American, Latino, and folks say, well, you're not doing enough for this group and you're not doing enough for that group. And so getting that board to play a role that's genuinely driven by mission and purpose and goals and direction and overcome their own sort of personal agenda, that's part of the work too. And LeJune Montgomery Tabron, our president, has done an amazing job of transforming our board to a board that has embraced what's called the Carver Policy Governance Model. We're the first large foundation to, I believe, embrace this model. It's a model of governance that squarely defines the role of the board as policy setting and monitoring and holding accountable the CEO for the execution of those policies within specific constraints, but not micromanaging. I hope there's going to be a revolution in philanthropy and many more foundations are going to embrace the Carver governance model. It's important. It's really important when you're doing work that is this messy and this complex. So I said yes, I joined the foundation, and my own belief system, spiritually, personally, philosophically, is that what we focus on is the thing that we enlarge in our life. And so I can understand reaching a decision not to do race work anymore if, in fact, it is forcing you to focus on the pain and the negativity and the disparities and the inequities to the point where your emotional response to it is always raw. You know, you can reach a point where you say, I think I need to focus on the ocean, something, you know. But the thing that we focus on does become enlarged. And so I said, we can't just be anti-racism, because the subconscious, you know, doesn't really respond to the anti, it just responds to the racism. So the racism becomes the focus. We had to shift it and say that promotes racial equity. And we went, and they put those in the minutes, so it was real. We went from just anti-racism to promoting racial equity. Now, what did that mean? Again, if you've lived, I say to people, there's some advantages to growing older. None of them are physical, trust me. But at least if they are, it hasn't, you know, I haven't heard that voice yet. But I think you do gain a little wisdom, and it occurred to me and to many that we keep fighting the same fights over and over again. I mean, the schools are more segregated today than they were with Brown versus the Board of Education. So what's missing from our approach? Well, I think what is missing from our approach is the healing component. And the healing component is about wholeness. The healing component is about acknowledging the false belief in a hierarchy of human value and acknowledging the harm that that belief has done and continues to do. The healing component is about changing the genuine hearts of enough people, reaching a critical mass of understanding, I believe was the term that you used this morning. Understanding, but not just cognitive understanding, heartfelt understanding, so that people are committed to the long haul and they've overcome the stereotypes and the biases. So we did focus in on promoting racial equity, but bringing a healing component to it. Now, for a lot of people back then, healing implied race relations, and the advocacy community was like, that's soft, that's California, that's fluff. We don't need better race relations. And some people, I remember one of our strong advocates said, I don't want to talk about inclusion. I don't care if you include me or not. I just want equal opportunity. And so this idea of trying to build bridges was sort of poo-pooed by the advocacy community because it wasn't hard enough and it wasn't focused enough and it wasn't going to bring about policy change. So we kind of had this tension, racial healing versus attacking structural racism, institutional racism. What we finally realized is that it's not either or, it's both and. But we had sort of fed the dichotomy by creating visuals that had one pillar for structural racism and one pillar for healing. And we threw that away and created a circle that showed that it was a continuum and that you really do have to do both. The healing component was embedded in our work because we felt the belief is the issue, and the belief has had a negative impact on all groups. So our approach includes Native American, Asian American, Pacific Islander, Native Hawaiian, African American, Latino, and white America to some degree. Because the belief in a hierarchy of human value is a mythology that has had devastating consequences for all of us, more so for some groups than others. But by casting a broader net and bringing folks in, it helps us to take the focus off of what's called the oppression Olympics and put the focus on our collective humanity. Now, does that mean that the African American community and the Black Lives Matter movement has any less currency or saliency? Absolutely not. Does that mean that the Native American concerns are of any less of a priority because they make up a small percentage of the population? Absolutely not. Does it mean that the Latino, Hispanic get far more emphasis because they are one of the fastest growing minority groups in the country? It doesn't mean any of that. It means that all of these groups have felt the pain and the consequence of our country's refusal to jettison the belief in a hierarchy of human value. And all of these groups are much stronger working in collaboration as a we than they are as just us. And so our model for doing this work has been inclusive. I'll go through very quickly how we structured the work initially and then fast forward to where we are today. And then I'll talk about some of the other, I'll probably interweave some of the amazing work that other foundations are doing. But so we spent about a year and a half exploring the field. We looked at the last major governmental initiative on these issues, and that was the Clinton Commission on Race. Although that never made the light of day, they really did do a lot of work. And they had scanned and identified, and they had mobilized activities over 600 campuses around the country. And so we thought it was helpful to build on that beginning of that work. We asked our board for $100 million to support this work over 5 years. At the time, it was the biggest request we had been made in terms of a programmatic area. They didn't give us that $100 million. They gave us $75 million, which was good, but the other 25 went to Brazil to create an endowment there for Brazil to deal with racism. If you think America's in denial on racism, Brazil just boggles the mind when you really get into that one. So I was very proud of the foundation having made that decision. So we divided our work up into 4 big buckets initially. At the time that this work started, America was, does anybody remember the phrase? This was before Obama, just about the time he decided to run for president. Post-racial, right? We had dealt with that. We were all good. And so we knew we had to shift the national discourse and get people to understand that we were far from post-racial. So a lot of our first big bucket of investment had to do with that need for that narrative shift. Think about that polling data where it was always split. If you looked at the polls over the last 20 years, you always had people of color seeing the world one way, white people seeing it another way. So we knew we had to help change the narrative. We also knew that if we succeeded in that, there would be a willingness to become accountable for outcomes. And you all know many of our boards in philanthropy come from the private sector. And so accountability, metrics for outcomes and impact, is that not the mantra of our boardrooms? I probably get in trouble when I say this, but I want to see the mantra for metrics for the status quo. Where are the metrics for how we're doing what we're doing now? The systems. The metrics aren't there. But as soon as we talk about change and innovation, gotta have metrics. Just saying. The next big area that we wanted to fund in, Kellogg's signature as a foundation is about working with communities, grassroots communities. So we knew that the Clinton Commission had documented about 400 community-based efforts in the field of what's called race relations or overcoming racism. And so we put out a request for proposals from communities. The request for proposals was only on our website, and it was only on our website for about 60 days. We thought we'd get 400 to 500 responses. We hoped we would. We got about 1,000 responses, and they came from every state in America, except Wyoming. I don't know why Wyoming didn't respond. We used to joke and say maybe that was because Dick Cheney lived there, but we funded in Wyoming anyway. And these were amazing, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the examples, but these were just community practitioners saying, yes, we want to get some more funding, we wanted to grow the field, to continue to do this work to improve racial dynamics, to heal. I always tell the story of this group in Chicago who said that they were working with formerly incarcerated folks, and they were trying to help them get employed. But they understood that many of these people who had been incarcerated because of racism, and they were going to come out and confront more racism, and there was no curriculum, there was no way to help these people grapple with the reality of racism. Now, you remember, you're in a foundation, so you read this on paper and you interview and you do your due diligence, but you can't really, truly understand what people are saying to you. What we didn't know, which is now common knowledge in Chicago, literally, these men had been incarcerated, had been tortured into confessions, many of them, by a racist leadership there in Chicago. And so when they said racism was a factor, they were talking about that phenomenon, but we didn't have any way of knowing it. Now, they've actually given reparations to some of those men. But they wanted to bring racism into this employment training work, and they wanted to equip these individuals with tools for coming to grips with this aspect of their experience. It's a fascinating effort, and we hoped that they would then share that with the broader field. There was another piece of work. Former members of the FBI came to us, sent in a proposal. They wanted to figure out how they could improve the activities of those in the FBI, make them more aware of the power of racism in terms of their work. So there were roughly about, we funded, I think, about 300 of those applications. The third area where we funded was what we call action-oriented research. And we're actually very excited about what came from that. The Kellogg Foundation is not a traditional sort of research funder. We don't fund universities and, just generally fund ongoing research. One of my biases there is that every research paper I've ever read that comes out of academia, the last paragraph always says, what's needed is more research. Right? So we wanted to fund action-oriented research, research that practitioners could use in the field. And a lot of the emerging insights about implicit bias and unconscious bias and racial anxiety, groups like the Perception Institute and John Powell's work, Kirwan Institute, opportunity mapping. We were supporting that work on opportunity mapping that's really had a powerful influence. Dolores Acevedo Garcia has built up an amazing diversity data resource and tools that really begins to analyze what's really going on in terms of children in diverse communities. So we funded action-oriented research. That has a lot of good things have come from that. We also supported the New Press and several of the books that they published working towards social justice. We were partners with the New Jim Crow publicity and promotional campaign. So we feel pretty good about that piece of the funding. And the last one, the one that was the hardest sell, was what we call our anchor institution strategy. Now, when many of you in philanthropy hear the word anchor institution, you think of hospitals and universities, those large institutions within communities that have a stake in staying in those communities, and there's a big movement to help them become more socially responsible, if you will, and accountable to communities. But we were talking about the major civil rights organizations as anchor institutions for this work. The major civil rights organizations upon whose shoulders we stand today. Were it not for the courage and the tenacity and the determination of groups like the NAACP, like the Urban League, like the National Congress of American Indians, the Asian American Pacific Islander Health Forum, and the list goes on. There are about 11 of them. So we were able to give general operating support to these anchor institutions. Now, there are partners in philanthropy that also fund them. This was the time of the recession, and the very viability of these institutions was in question during that time. And they were no longer sexy for the corporate sector. You may recall that many of those institutions used to get a lot of their funding from groups like Pepsi, et cetera, and that has sort of waned. So for a philanthropy to really decide to give general operating support to these organizations was unprecedented at the time. Now, one of the pitfalls when you decide to give large general operating grants to nonprofits over time, you can create a dependency, and so you can inadvertently be harmful if you don't work closely with those grantees and develop, a process whereby if your grants went away, they wouldn't collapse. And so that's an interesting phenomenon too. You may notice in your boardrooms and in your grant-making efforts that the concept of sustainability becomes like the mantra for impact and outcomes. More so when you're working with grantees of color, I find, than the more traditional institutions. We've been sustaining the traditional institutions for decades, but as soon as we start supporting the smaller community organizations, we got to have a sustainability plan. So those were the 4 big buckets. We did evaluation work. We were able to see the impact of our work. One of the metrics that's emerging for this work, which is critical, it's at the heart of the work, is social network mapping. And we were able to really see how organizations that prior to our funding didn't connect, didn't work at all, now work together on a regular basis. And that was one of our requirements for the anchor institution strategy, that they would have to work together. And they did so kicking and screaming at first. But we knew we'd turn the corner when the Sikh temple, when that tragedy occurred and the shooting occurred at the Sikh temple, I believe it was in Wisconsin. And all of those anchor institutions issued a collective statement saying, if you attack their church, you attack my church. And we've seen other illustrations of this solidarity on the parts of these groups. But we really knew because these were all groups of color, we really knew we'd turn the corner when it was time for the second round of funding. And they came to us and they said, you know, we're preaching to the choir here. We need to bring white majority groups into this anchor strategy. And we looked at each other and we said, wow, this is growth. And so we let them pick the groups, and it has accelerated, I believe, the quality and the scope of the work. So that was what we did. We funded over 10 years. We also convened all of our grantees, well over 500 of them, every year in Asheville, North Carolina, because of the mountains. And it really was a lovely retreat setting. And we treated our grantees very well, and we brought them together so they could share and build on. We really had a goal of building the field, and we think we've been effective at that. Now, some of you may have seen our statement that was issued where we pulled out of North Carolina. We were going to have a big summit there, but after their refusal to honor the human rights of the LGBT community, we pulled out. Now, it was at a financial cost to us, and I was, because, you know, you sign these contracts to bring, you know, all these people and use every room in a hotel, and then you say, we're not coming. Well, the hotel says, yeah, but you signed a contract. But we were able to still make that stand, and I was very proud of the Kellogg Foundation. So instead, we're going to California, which makes some of our West Coast folks very happy. What are some of the critical lessons that we've learned in this work that I think I would like to share with you? I also would like to draw your attention to the broader momentum right now in terms of racial equity in the philanthropic field. The tragedies of the last few years in terms of the violent deaths, not only of men, but of women, of African American males, of Latino, Hispanic. I'm not as aware of the Asian American death rates at the hands of police, but I'm sure they are there. The disproportionate suicide rates in Native American communities. These tragedies have been revealed with the help of technology. And so there really is a shift in the consciousness of the country right now, and philanthropy is reflecting that, and philanthropy helped to create that. The Buffalo Community Foundation is doing some amazing work with their Racial Equity Roundtable. And I want to just read to you just one paragraph from a report that they have issued, and I encourage you to go to their website. And it says, fulfilling our region's potential will require policy changes within government and will require institutions and businesses to explicitly focus on diversity, inclusion, and equity. It will require eliminating the disparities that are created across our segregated neighborhoods, and it will require a broader community and individual understanding of the way these issues impact us on a daily basis. Buffalo is committed to progress. Buffalo is going to benefit big time from a collective commitment to achieving racial equity, situational fairness that eliminates the outcome differentials that are too often predicated and predicted by race. So here's a broad multi-sector effort on the part led by this community foundation in Buffalo that's being very explicit about racial equity. It's exciting work. We were able to be, in some ways, I believe, influential in this based on a product that we produce called the business case for racial equity. Now, the business case for racial equity that we produced was really in response to criticisms that we didn't have enough representatives from the private sector on the front of this work. And so we reached out to some other than the usual players and worked closely with them to produce a document which you can download from our website that really talks about the numbers, right? What it would mean economically for this country if we achieved racial equity. What would it mean in terms of tax revenues? What would it mean in terms of GDP? What would it mean in terms of it's the economy, folks? And it's been embraced by many people. Now, we've learned from the Chamber of Commerce folks that what we call a business case is not what they call a business case. And so we're working with some Chamber of Commerce representatives to modify that so that it speaks more in a more specific way to the concerns of business. But we do think it's helped to create a framework for a regional effort to show that we can move a region forward, that there's a we in this, there's a us in that, in this, in terms of economic benefits. One of the other critical lessons that we learned was the power of story. Now, I shared with you my painful memory from childhood and the loss of my cousin's sister. Our brains are wired to remember story. It is no accident that television tells us these stories day after day after day, and they keep us glued. This is the age of the brain. Cognitive science is really revealing that the narratives that we hear and see shape our beliefs and our perceptions and our actions. So story is critically important to changing this belief in a taxonomy. Stories that haven't been told, new stories that should be created, but one of the biggest places we need to be investing is in creating a new narrative of who we are as a country, how we got to now. There are a few books out there now that describe the biggest ideas in the history of humanity in terms of how we got to now, right? And I always read those books and I shudder that racism is never mentioned. That's how we got to now, as far as I'm concerned, by adhering to this absurd idea that some people are more valuable than others based on their physical characteristics. So story is important, and we learn that lesson and we try to build on that lesson. I will talk about this latest effort we're undertaking, but we actually had a profound meeting a few weeks ago with about 32 people from the Hollywood entertainment industry, and they agreed with us that they are the keepers, if you will, or the purveyors of the narratives, and they need to be part of this work, and we're very excited about that. It will get us there faster. I mentioned that the belief system happened in the first information revolution when the printing press was created and became, the vehicle for information to be disseminated. We're in the second information revolution right now. And if we don't do this work now, the algorithms that will determine our lives in this century will carry the same absurdity. That's why this moment is so critically important. And we have to bring the Googles and the Microsofts and all the big tech companies into this work. They're really moving forward with the virtual reality tools, even in our nation's classrooms. And they say that those tools, those accommodations, if you will, for taking in the images, that they enhance one's capacity for empathy. If that's true, and it probably is, and they're doing the research, don't we need to use those tools for this work? Because key to giving up our biases is developing the capacity to be empathetic, to build authentic relationships across racial lines. My daughter's about to get married, and the marriage is an interracial, interreligious marriage. And we were all together in Italy recently, and it was a wonderful trip. And actually, that's when he proposed to her. And I was there celebrating one of my cousin's 80th birthdays. And she organized this trip, right? And we went to Italy because they're deeply Christian, and she wanted to go to all the religious sites in Italy. And so somewhere in the course of the conversation, my daughter's, who wasn't quite her fiance, but became her fiance on the trip, he indicated that he had been raised as a Muslim, that he was a Muslim. And you could feel the shift in the tension, in the room. And my cousin, who I love dearly, who's one of the most brilliant women I've ever met in my life, she said, well, as long as you're not a terrorist. Oh my goodness, right? How can I fix that, right? How can I step in and make that not have happened, right? But again, as she gets to know him and gets to know his family and gets to know the beautiful dynamic that they share, the way they value family, the way they love and demonstrate love, that's the only way she's going to overcome that bias, through an authentic relationship with someone. She's going to have to come to face with those stereotypes that she holds very deeply. But narrative change and changing the way we receive information is a big part of this work. We have to bring the Washington Post, the New York Times, CNN, and it's not this usual politicalization of the concept. We have to transcend that. And that's going to be hard right now, because nothing is more politicized right now than every discussion, particularly discussions that relate to race. The Community Foundation in Buffalo is doing amazing work, and theirs is a multi-sectoral partnership. There's some exciting work happening in Salinas, California, and it's part of a national effort some of you may know about, and it's called Healing Informed Governing for Racial Equity. Healing Informed Governing for Racial Equity. There is a movement to bring public sector organizations, government leaders together on this issue of racial equity and racial healing. The California Endowment is helping to support that work. The California Endowment has really stepped up in terms of philanthropic leadership on racial equity. They are a big part of the Executive Alliance, the Men and Boys of Color work. Now, I know that's a hot topic here in the DC area. I know the ACLU has filed suit about the creation of the school for men and boys of color in this district. And so it's difficult work. But failure to understand how racism has played out disproportionately or differently through a gender lens is, again, I think, an evidence of our lack of understanding and appreciation for the complexity of racism. And it's unfortunate that this is happening here, that there's a need to fight against or to sue. I believe we need not either or, but both and. And the dynamics for women of color are just as horrible. It's a different horror. And choosing to focus on one doesn't minimize or de-emphasize the need to focus on the other. Again, it's about understanding. We have more collaboration right now in philanthropy on these issues than we've ever had before. The Executive Alliance is one illustration. There are many other illustrations. Some of you in this room know about them. Susan Batten played a key role in creating, I think it was your brainchild, the Racial Equity and Philanthropy Group. And it's a small organization or group of foundations come together, executives privately, to support each other in this work within their foundations. In terms of the inside work, right? How do you take this commitment to racial equity and make it part of your performance measurement system? How do you build it into your structures so that every employee has a performance plan that evolves growing in terms of their appreciation and understanding of this work? How do you track and monitor your grant making? It's one thing to make grants with a racial equity lens. It's another thing to track how that changes over time. And we've done that at the Kellogg Foundation, and our interaction with the Racial Equity and Philanthropy Group helped to create the momentum for doing that. Now there's a group of HR directors of the major foundations that come together on a quarterly basis, and they work to improve policies and practices. How do you recruit effectively in terms of a diverse staff? And how do you do that with a racial equity understanding? It's one thing to have a diverse staff. It's another thing to deal with it from a lens of racial equity and fairness. How do you cope with the fact that the more people of color that you bring in, the more people of color are going to rotate out? How do you deal with that? How do you deal with the fact that there are more diverse people? You have greater risk for tensions in and between the diverse groups. And so there's the tension or the perception that the Latino group is being treated one way, the African American group is being treated another way, the Asian American Pacific Island group is being treated another way, and there are no Native Americans, or if there are only one or two, and what are you going to do about that? So it's complicated and it's messy, but one of the ways that you can, I think, accelerate your own progress in this space is to be part of these peer support groups. And brilliant ideas surface in terms of how do you manage, how do you cope with this? How do you diversify your boards? And what does that mean in terms of racial equity work? There is a lot of collaboration going on now in terms of philanthropy. There's much more support than there ever was for people who are doing this work. I think more importantly than what's going on in philanthropy, you can tell I must be nearing retirement, right? But is what's happening in communities. What organizations are really able to do right now. The field itself has taken off. The work on implicit bias, the work on stereotype threat and racial anxiety, it is amazing. And they can't keep up with the demand for training. The partnerships between the philanthropic sector and the public sector. We have an emerging and evolving partnership with the National Park Service, right? Now, that was an uphill battle. Park Service, what does that got to do with racial equity? Well, if all the monuments that you go to around the country tell the story of racial hierarchy, that's a critical intervention. To make the monuments and the parks tell a true story of who we are as a country and how we got to now. It's tough, it's hard work. So there's so much going on in the broader sense in the field right now. We have funded Phil Goff's work, who's working with over 50 police departments around this country, doing in-depth psychological testing and building capacity around the issues of implicit bias. Phil talks about how gender identity, if you will, or masculinity identity is as important as racial issues when dealing with police. He says it's not race, it's masculinity or gender. And I sit back and say, oh, but you have to explore the racial roots of that because it's all connected. But imagine over 50 police departments stepping up to do this work, volunteering. They're not mandated to do this work. They're doing this work because they feel it's necessary. So I'm saying all this to say that we have this unprecedented moment, I believe. I know this is being taped, but I'm going to be honest anyway. When I went to the Kellogg Foundation, I said I was going to stay 5 years. I wasn't as crazy as I look. I didn't think I could handle commuting forever. And so I said it would be a 5-year run. Well, it's almost 10. And so I've been thinking about, how do I extricate and move on? But I wasn't very successful in communicating that. And so once again, I decided I would pray for guidance on this. And I really did. I asked for the words for a resignation letter. And instead, I woke up with truth, racial healing, and transformation. Now, I knew what that was. I knew it was a truth and reconciliation process for this country. There was no question in my mind. And so I called our CEO and I said, do you think we could do this? She took it to the board, and there was a unanimous response. And unanimous is not often happen, in philanthropy. Yes, it was time. What do we mean by truth, racial healing, and transformation? We really do mean designing a truth and reconciliation process for this country. Now, we started out by examining all the TRCs that have happened all over the world, and there have been over 44 of them. And trying to cull from that the lessons that might be applicable here in America. Remember, ours is a historic pattern. It's not, we're talking centuries, if you will. That's kind of unique. We have many, many diverse groups in this country. And of course, we have the history of divisiveness that is grounded in the politicalization of the reality of racism. So that makes it even tougher. But all that said, we have engaged right now over 85 organizations and another 20 plus thought leaders. So I say over 100 partners. And collectively, their reach is right now, a third of them actually, because we've done these surveys and we're doing all this online work, which is not where I'm comfortable, but it's where the world is, right? Their reach is 189 million people in terms of their own networks. So we're designing this effort not to be a government-mandated effort, but to reflect what I believe is the strength of America, which is its social organizational structure, infrastructure, if you will. It's multi-sectoral in nature, so we're bringing in the private sector, the academic sector, the public sector, and the business sector, and again, that's a challenge. So right now we're in the design phase of this effort, and we asked ourselves, how did the belief in racial hierarchy become embedded? How did it become the connective tissue of America? It became that way through narrative. It also became that way through what we think are the three big areas where we have to intercede in order to jettison the belief. One of the best ways to sustain the perception of difference and the belief in hierarchy is through separation. If you look back historically, Native Americans were isolated on reservations. Segregation has been a component of our world, of our reality. Colonization is the tool. So one of the areas that we're focusing on is separation. The other way that the belief has been embedded is through the law. It's in our Constitution. It's in state constitutions. It is embedded in civil law, in criminal law, and in the policies that evolve from that law, like the voting issues that we face historically and today. So a second major area of design work is the law. And the third area is the economy. The hierarchical structure is embedded through inequality that is driven by our economic policies and practices. So those are the three areas that we're designing the work to take place in. And overarching above both of those is narrative change. And I have these fantasies of the major IT companies, of Hollywood, of folks getting on board and us creating a different story of our country. A real story grounded in the authentic victories and struggles and partnerships and realities. And I will tell you, a big part of our design that we had in America Healing was to bring people together for a full day of actually sharing stories with one another that are grounded in their experiences. We started out the first year by asking people to talk about why they do this work, like the story of my loss of my cousin. Or it could have been the story of the loss of my firstborn. Or it could have been the story of the premature death of my father when a doctor didn't treat his lung cancer. The people came together and they shared their stories. We learned over time, though, that it was better to find a way to create a prompt for those stories that was more positive. And our evaluation showed that it was the most successful effort we'd done for that healing day. And the prompt became sharing a story in which your humanity was affirmed. Now, that prompt presupposes, particularly if you're a person of color, that your humanity needs to be affirmed. And trust me, if you are a person of color in America, your humanity does need to be affirmed. And you have to develop the muscle to affirm it for yourself. But that prompt opened up these amazing stories in the lives of people. And we facilitate and orchestrate this, and it goes on for an entire day, 500 people in groups of 25. But if you have how many have been at America Healing and had that experience? Some people in the room? When you've heard the story of 20 or more diverse people whose lives you might never have known about, you might never have interacted with them, when you've sat in a safe space and shared the stories of that many people different from you, something in your own humanity is altered and changed. And you're not the same. So the narrative work, the story work, and even, how many of you saw 12 Years a Slave? Some of you are watching Roots right now. There's something about pulling you in at a heart level into the lives of people, either virtually. I think it's much more powerful when it's real and in person. But there's a power in that is transformative. And that's part of the work. The racial healing is the second big bucket. So we have narrative change, racial healing, and then the other three that I described. But over the years, we have funded what I would consider a leadership cadre of folks who are in their communities dealing with the realities of racism and building the resilience within their communities and leading with their hearts. And these are what we call racial healing practitioners. And it's very humbling, really, to be in their presence, particularly the diverse presence. We have Alaska Native Hawaiian people reminding us of the indigenous values of their culture. And so a term that you've all probably heard is decolonization, right? You know, taking away the mindset of the colonizer and bringing people back. Well, they shifted from decolonization to indigenization. And I thought, wow, that's a breakthrough. You know, let's honor the values and the culture of the indigenous people in a way that we haven't. Let's make that okay and more than okay. But when you're in the presence of people who bring a different set of values and a different culture and a different mindset, and you all interact, I can only say that the tone, if you will, the energy of the room changes. And so the commitment to this inclusive strategy in this work, it's part of the strategy. And it's not touchy-feely, it's strategic. You have to work on multiple levels simultaneously in order to bring about the change. So those are the 5 design teams. We have some amazing thought leaders who are leading the work in terms of designing this effort. We imagine that there will be a national commission. We have 2 honorary co-chairs now, former governors who've agreed to co-chair, William Winter from Mississippi and Duval Patrick from Massachusetts. And we will have regional commissioners as well, because we think the best way to approach this is by regions across the United States. And those regional commissions will address and respond to the priorities and the urgencies within those regions. So that's the broad sort of overview of the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation effort. Initially, we thought we'd turn it over to a government entity. Bad idea. And so we approached some government entities about it. The U.S. Institute of Peace. Now, the U.S. Institute of Peace goes all over the world telling people how to do truth and reconciliation, but their congressional mandate does not allow them to work in the United States. How about that? So, but they are a partner. They're a partner in another kind of way. They're a learning and educational partner with us. We're also doing some work with, or building on the work that HUD is doing right now in terms of affirmatively furthering fair housing. That'll be right there in that separation era. And many of the grantees we have all over the country have helped to get that new rule where communities who receive housing dollars HUD dollars, are going to have to address the barriers to equality and equity and opportunity. But they need to build into that work, we believe, the work on racial healing and explicitly on addressing structural racism. So there are many opportunities right now to, I believe, fast forward America into a space that it has never achieved. I believe that the focus on the belief in a hierarchy of human value takes us way upstream. You know how the social determinants of health movement was built around, you got to go upstream. I believe the place that's really way upstream are the beliefs that we hold in our heads and in our hearts. Because when those change, they will drive different behaviors. Different voting behaviors, please, Lord. And different resource allocation decisions and behaviors. So it is truly a joy. The foundation is behind this 100%, and the partners, eventually, the TRHT, we call it, will have to have a nerve center of some kind that is monitoring and managing its implementation. When all of the entities that we tried to give it to said, oh, no, we'll partner, but we can't take the lead on anything about racism. Are you kidding? We kept it as a foundation, but our job as a foundation is to fund. It's not to do the work, per se. So once we get through the design phase, we'll probably put out an RFP and look for an entity that can really carry this work forward. But one thing's for sure, we believe it's an idea whose time has come. Now, some people say, why don't you call it reparations? Why don't you call it reconciliation? We don't call it reconciliation. We call it transformation, because in America, there's nothing to reconcile. The belief in racial hierarchy is part of the DNA of this country. So there's really nothing for us to go back to. We have to go forward. And that's why we use the term transformation. Now, you can speak spiritually or philosophically or psychologically and say we need to reconcile the contradictions. We need to come to grips with the absurdity of what we've created, and we need to commit to transforming ourselves into a country that's capable of recognizing and actualizing its true stated ideals as a democracy. So that's why we say transformation, not reconciliation. Then others say, well, what about reparations? If the transformation occurs, the reckoning and the need to repair the damage will flow from that. Because there will be a heartfelt understanding that the children who are born in this country today, most of whom are children of color, let me be clear, We're not talking 2040, 2030, 2020. We're talking right now. Most of the children born in this country today are children of color. And most of them are coming into low-income or impoverished families and communities. So when we think about the moment we're in right now, it's unprecedented on so many levels. And we must create for our children, for the future of this country, a different environment that says you are an equal human being, you are no less than anyone else, and our structures reflect that appreciation of your equality and your deserving of equity. And that's what the TRHT is about. Thank you all very much.
From all of us at the Washington Regional Association of Grantmakers, we thank you for watching our series, Putting Racism on the Table. We hope that you will use the discussion guide that follows at the end of this video, or that you'll go to our website, www.washingtongrantmakers.org, for more information. I'm really pleased that we are putting racism on the table.